Hi guys, Erin here. In this video, you'll learn about modalities of measurement, which are different ways that we can study the external expression of a construct. And you'll also learn about scales of measurement, which is the different ways that we can categorize and even quantify variables. Here's where this video fits into the context of our course. So in previous videos, we talked about constructs. Constructs can be manifested in different ways. These are called modalities. It's up to the researcher to decide which measurement modality fits best with how they operationalize a construct. What do I mean by this? Well, let's use the example of hunger. What does hunger mean to you? How would you operationalize it? How would you measure hunger? Well, maybe for you, the most important aspect of hunger is how somebody feels, their subjective feeling of hunger. If this is the case, then you would want to measure hunger using a self-report questionnaire or survey. This is an example of one. It's on a Likert scale. You've probably seen these kind of questions before. The benefit of a self-report measurement is that it measures your construct in a really direct way, but the downside is that it's subjective. That's a good and bad thing, depending on the way that you define it. It's a bad thing because the way that you feel hunger might be different than the way that I feel hunger, and there's no way of knowing how much of a difference there is in between us. And also, people might respond differently to a self-report questionnaire based not so much on how they actually feel, but how they think the researcher wants them to respond. So the downside is, although that it directly measures the construct, it might not be as valid or reliable. If, however, you wanted to find a more objective way of studying hunger, you might choose to measure it using a physiological measurement procedure, which measures your body's response. Examples of this are your heart rate or your skin response. These are physiological ways of studying anxiety, for example. In the context of hunger, there's been studies where they've had people swallow a balloon and they look to see how much the balloon shrinks or grows as a way of studying how much the muscles are contracting. So this is a physiological manifestation of hunger. You can't lie about it. Here's another example. In my research, I use EEG to study kids' brain responses during language or other cognitive tasks as a way of studying how they process language and how much they change as they learn. Again, you can't lie, your brain can't lie, it's more objective. But the downside is that physiological measurements can be more expensive, and because they're more medical, people may respond differently in the lab than they would in more real life situations. And so the downside is they might not be as valid. The final way that we can study a construct is using what we call a behavioral measurement. So rather than studying the construct itself, we study some behavior that happens as a result of the construct. An example of this is a standardized test as a way of studying intelligence. In the context of hunger, we might look to see how often somebody goes to the fridge, or we might see and measure how much they eat in a sitting. The benefit of this measurement is that it's super flexible. You can design tests that measure a variety of different behaviors. The downside is that you have to be really careful to make sure that you're measuring the construct itself and not the situation. So for example, I might go to the fridge more often when there's chocolate cake in the fridge, or I might eat more at Thanksgiving when there's more choices available to me. So these are the three different modalities, three different ways we can study how a construct is expressed. There's no right or wrong answer. What's important is that you justify your choices and you pick one that fits best with how you operationalize that construct. You can also combine different measurement modalities in the same study if you want to minimize the downside and make the most of what each of them have to offer. Okay, so that's modalities of measurement. Let's talk now about scales of measurement. This is the different ways that we can categorize variables. Throughout the course, we'll be talking about different ways that we can study the relationship between two variables. Depending on the scale that's used to measure those variables, we're going to be able to do different things and look at different kinds of relationships. So at this point, you should in the course, you should be aware of these 4 different scales and what they do. And throughout the course, we'll be talking about which situations you can use different kinds of comparison, different kinds of statistical tests, depending on the scale that you use. So let's talk about them now. There's 4 different scales of measurement. At the most basic, we have the nominal scale. This basically categorizes the variables into different categories. It gives a verbal label to them. So for example, the classic way of defining gender bins people into male or female. You can categorize people based on the country they live in, the political party they voted for, the color of their hair, the color of their eyes, etc. The thing to note here is that using the nominal scale, we can say that people are different based on those categories, but we have no way of knowing how much they're different. So for example, gender, just being male doesn't mean that you have more or less gender than being female. All we can say is that you're different. The next way of categorizing variables uses the ordinal scale. Again, in this scale, we're assigning people a verbal category, but in this case, we have some sort of order to arrange them in. So for example, first, second, third place on a race, for example, small, medium, or large, low SES, high SES. We've got a sense with this scale that there's some difference, and we have an idea of how these categories are organized relative to one another, but we don't know how much bigger one is relative to the other. So we know small is smaller than medium, but we don't know by how much. And we don't know if the difference between small and medium is the same as the difference between medium and large. So as a result, the nominal scale and the ordinal scale with these verbal categories allow us to describe the categories. We can say, for example, how many males, how many females are in a study, but we are really limited in the kind of statistics that we can do with these scales. The next 2 scales I'm going to tell you about are more what we call quantitative scales. We're assigning a number to each value of the variable, and as a result, we can do much more in the way of statistics. The first one is the interval scale. It arranges variables into categories of equal intervals. So you can think of, for example, thermometer when we talk about this. When something is measured on an interval scale, we know that there is a consistent and meaningful difference between each value on the scale. So for example, if you wake up in the morning and it's 15 degrees and it's going to go up to 25, you know that that change of 10 degrees Celsius is going to be it's going to feel the same as the difference between going from 5 degrees to 15 degrees. Another example of the scale is the more modern way of talking about gender, where instead of binning people as either male or female, we put gender on a continuum and everybody falls somewhere in the middle between masculine and feminine. With this scale, 0 is usually the middle of the continuum, and it's possible to have values that are smaller than 0. The last scale that we're going to talk about is the ratio scale. When you think about this, you can think of a ruler or a way of measuring your weight. So this scale arranges values of a variable into quantitative categories, gives them a number. There's a consistent and meaningful difference between each value on the scale, but here 0 means there is none. We call this absolute 0. So it's impossible to weigh less than 0 pounds, and it's impossible to be less than 0 centimeters, for example. Here's another way of thinking about how these different scales relate to one another. As I said before, with the nominal and the ordinal scale, you're limited in the kind of stats you do. You can basically just describe how many people are in each group. With the interval and the ratio scale, we can do things like take a correlation between 2 variables. If you want more information, check out this link here for this video, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.